Hi, my name is Michelle Reddy and I work for the Fiji Women's Fund. The Fiji Women's Fund is an initiative of the Australian government through its program called Pacific Women Shaping Pacific Development. We are a 5-year program and our mandate is to support women's groups, networks and organizations in Fiji to achieve and transform gender equality in Fiji. The main role of women's funds across the world, so women's funds have been around and one of the oldest women's funds is Mama Cash, Global Fund for Women. The way that women's funds work or function is really to be the resourcing arm of the women's movement. So our key mandate is for us to be able to influence and transform philanthropy and increase resources for women and girls. And in our case, to increase resources for women and girls in Fiji. And when we talk about resource mobilization, we talk about resources in its all entirety. So we're talking about financial resources and non-financial resources. Non-financial resources can include skills, knowledge, networks, and relationships. So in the Fiji Women's Fund, that's what we try and do. So one part of our role is to mobilize resources and at the same time to support our grantee partners. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we have worked quite closely with our grantee partners in, trying to understand their experiences, what are some strategies that they're using within their communities to support the work that they're doing, what are some challenges as well that they're experiencing so that we are able to amplify those experiences. In Fiji's case, at the moment, we are a COVID-free country, but a couple of months ago, that was not the case. And what made the pandemic more difficult to survive through is that Fiji also experienced a tropical cyclone, which was TC Harold. So alongside the pandemic, we also had a natural disaster. And so what we were hearing from our grantee partners is that whilst they were trying to increase knowledge and awareness around how to better prepare for COVID-19, they also had to go through recovery activities. So we had a lot of communities lose their source of income. There was a lot of flooding. And so a lot of women's organizations and networks that we work with really had to rethink their projects. And so we had a lot of partners ask us for a no-cost extension, which is, give us time to work out what strategies that help us, but also give us support in terms of how we can work remotely. So for a lot of our partners, one of the challenges that they faced was around resourcing organizational co-heads. And so for us, the women's movement is nothing without strong, resilient women's networks and organizations. And for them to be resilient, it's really important as women's funds to provide that flexibility and to be an empathetic funder and a partner in a pandemic where things may not necessarily seem like we figured it all out, because it's quite new for us and quite different. And so a lot of the groups that we are working with are trying to figure that out as they work alongside their communities. Some of the other things that we were able to support some of our grantee partners, especially those who are providing service provision around the area of counseling, trauma counseling, or even providing sexual, reproductive, and health rights services, was there was a definite need for us to help them source other forms of self-care support, because they were working longer hours, they were always traveling, they didn't have enough time to really focus on re-energizing themselves. So a lot of our support has been looking at ways that we can use our existing funding to build the resilience of the organizational staff members, because without the staff or without the people in the organization, you can't have any form of recovery, or you can't build and contribute to a resilient community. I think the other thing that we've found that's important as well. I mean, working with women living with disabilities and people with living with disabilities is that their experiences are far different from other groups, and so there's a definite need for us to be able to spend time listening and understanding what they are going through, but also being able to use our own social capital to influence the flow of resources, because that's been the experience that we've had here in Fiji, where you have both government and other stakeholders who are realigning or readjusting their budget to, I guess, address COVID-19 and tropical cyclone Harold recovery activities, but that also means that those resources are being taken away. And so the needs and actually the rights of people living with disabilities are heavily affected, and at most times are not heard of. So one of the things that we are trying to do is to work with our partners from the Fiji Disabled People's Federation to amplify those lived experiences, and to also influence the way that resources are being channeled to them. When you look at the Pacific, so the Fiji Women's Fund in particular works only in Fiji, so we only support women's groups that are based in Fiji, but we also, as part of a global network of women's funds, take the role of influencing philanthropy quite seriously. So we see ourselves as a women's fund that should analyze the flow of resources in the Pacific region. So we are one of the only two women's funds that is based and operates in the Pacific, and that means that there is this added calling for us to be able to do that. So in 2019, the Fiji Women's Fund partnered with Urgent Action Fund Asia and the Pacific, another sister fund, to undertake a scoping study, and we released or launched that study this year. It's called Where is the Money for Women and Girls in the Pacific, Mapping Trends, Opportunities and Gaps. And there were some really interesting findings that we got from that scoping study. So the scoping study specifically focused in Papua New Guinea and in Fiji, and that was because when you look at the flow of resources towards women's rights, those two countries in the Pacific receive a lot of support from a range of donors. But essentially what that report found that globally, when you look at funding from the OECD DEC countries, you can see that there is definitely an increase in funding towards women's rights. But when you analyze where that funding is going towards the Pacific, the study found that less than 1% of that funding is actually going directly to women's organizations. And so one must ask then, where does the money go to, and what is that money used for? And that's what that report actually analyzed. The report also showed that there were some key reasons why funding was not flowing to the Pacific Women's Organization. The Pacific region is so diverse. We are always seen as a region that's risky. We're too small. We're far away. We are a region that's affected by conflicts. We can also be seen, we're often seen as fragile and fragmented communities. And also, it can also be seen as a costly sort of region to work in. And sometimes funders also really don't know which organizations or which women's groups to support. So the report that apart from finding out that there was less than 1% going to directly to women's organizations in the Pacific, the report also found some really great opportunities that funders could support women's organizations in the Pacific. Apart from the key finding of less than 1% of funding going to Pacific women's organizations, the report also found other areas of collaborations, one of which was there's a need for funders to be able to share data in a transparent and accountable way. The other one was also for the establishment of a Pacific Feminist Fund. And the Pacific Feminist Fund would be a women's fund that works for the whole Pacific region. And so it would provide both granting, but also looking at ways of increasing its resource mobilization arm. Women's rights around the world are challenged, but when you look at women in the Pacific, their lived experiences are far more challenging because of the intersecting challenges that they face. And most often, when you look at women in the Pacific, their voices are often invisible. And so if spaces such as the WOW Global space is a really important one, because it's a space that we can amplify Pacific women's voices. So if you are keen and support women's rights, support Pacific women and girls and trans people's rights by supporting the Pacific Feminist Fund and the Fiji Women's Fund. Vinaka.